Welcome back to Nuclear Proliferation Explained. I'm William Spaniel. Today's topic is how secret nuclear weapons programs cause war. Let's get to it. Recall that in the baseline model of nuclear negotiations, we assumed that the opponent had perfect monitoring capabilities. That is, if the potential proliferator decided to build nuclear weapons, the opponent would see that, and then with that knowledge in hand, would then choose whether to fight a preventive war or not. In this lecture, we're going to relax that assumption. From a substantive perspective, this is a reasonable thing to investigate. In the modern era, development of nuclear weapons does not require a gigantic footprint. Gone are the days of having miles of building necessary to put in a gaseous diffusion plant. Instead, you can have a uranium centrifuge facility in a reasonably sized building. That means it's going to be harder for a potential proliferator's opponent to spot, observe, and then initiate some sort of countermeasure in response. Moreover, even if the opponent observes these facilities, they might not know what's actually going on within them. The potential proliferator might claim that these uranium centrifuges are being used for peaceful purposes. They're not trying to create highly enriched uranium for the purposes of a bomb, but are rather aiming for low enriched uranium for the purposes of fueling a nuclear power plant. And unfortunately, there's nothing different in the uranium centrifuge technology that gets you highly enriched uranium versus low enriched uranium. It's taking the same centrifuges and just running them for a longer period of time to get you from low to high enriched uranium. Putting all that together, we need to modify the original game to account for those sorts of concerns. In the original model, the opponent offered a concession to the potential proliferator. The potential proliferator could accept that concession, reject it and fight a war under the status quo distribution of power, or attempt to build nuclear weapons. If the potential proliferator chose to build, the opponent would then select whether to engage in a preventive war or not. And as I highlighted earlier, the critical assumption built into this baseline model is that the opponent is actively responding to the potential proliferator's decision to build. It is seeing that decision and basing its choice whether to prevent or not off of that observation. But in practice, what might actually be the case is that the opponent cannot actively distinguish between the potential proliferator accepting a deal truly and mimicking acceptance while secretly building on the side. To modify the game in light of those concerns, if the potential proliferator accepts or builds, the opponent cannot distinguish between the two of them, and in the dark, the opponent chooses whether to launch preventive war or not. This is the outcome plot of the original model. I want you to focus your attention up top. When the extent of the power shift is relatively large, the opponent prefers fighting a preventive war to allowing nuclear weapons to be successfully developed. The reason is that the opponent is seeing a large shift in the balance of power, and as a result, it is aware that it's going to have to make substantial concessions to the potential proliferator once the potential proliferator acquires nuclear weapons. In turn, it calculates that its payoff for fighting a preventive war and suffering the costs today is better than the alternative of having a very disadvantageous peace later on. In turn, the potential proliferator chooses not to develop nuclear weapons. It internalizes the credible threat of preventive war and realizes that trying to develop nuclear weapons is an exercise in futility. It will pay a cost to attempt to do so, but then the opponent will just veto that process with preventive war. As a result, we see a deal being struck in the present, which is based off the status quo distribution of power, as though the potential proliferator had no ability to produce nuclear weapons. But all of that logic is predicated on the opponent observing the potential proliferator trying to develop nuclear weapons and exercising its ability to fight a preventive war to stop that from happening. As a result, when we add secret weapons programs to the model, we don't really yet know what's going to happen with large shifts in the balance of power. Fortunately, we do have a good grasp of what's going on in the bottom right corner, where the cost to build is large compared to the extent of the power shift caused by nuclear development. In this region, the potential proliferator is calculating that nuclear weapons are simply not worth the investment. And so it is choosing not to develop nuclear weapons as a consequence of preventive war threats, but purely because the investment is not worthwhile. The opponent can work through this logic on his own and realize that the potential proliferator is not going to develop nuclear weapons because that investment is so bad. And as a consequence, when it sees the potential proliferator accepting a deal, it can rest comfortably knowing that the potential proliferator is not actually developing nuclear weapons in secret. And as a result, I've extended the line further out so that we know exactly what's happening when we have this bottom right-hand region, where the cost to build is relatively large compared to the extent of the power shift. Unfortunately, we're going to have to think harder about what happens in the deal region and what happens in the now erased too hot region. To get a better handle on what's going on, I want to review the logic of non-proliferation agreements. The opponent begins by thinking about what the world would look like if the potential proliferator had nuclear weapons in its arsenal, and the types of deals that it would have to strike to convince the potential proliferator not to use the nuclear weapons in war. In this figure, the dashed line represents what that deal would look like. The solid line represents the non-proliferation agreement. It's relatively close to the dashed line because the opponent needs to mimic what would be the case in a world with nuclear weapons to convince the potential proliferator not to develop them. But it doesn't have to give the potential proliferator the whole thing. It can take a little more for itself because the potential proliferator does not want to have to pay the cost of developing the nuclear weapons. What's critical for our purposes here is that the threat of preventive war is not what's driving the potential proliferator's willingness to accept the deal. It's purely a matter of opportunity cost. The potential proliferator is receiving something close to what it would obtain if it developed nuclear weapons, and it's not having to pay the cost. That's why it's accepting. It has nothing to do with the threat of preventive war here. As a result, as long as the opponent prefers making that concession to fighting a preventive war, it can offer that amount to the potential proliferator and rest assured that the potential proliferator is going to accept the deal. In essence, the observation problem goes away because the opponent is capable of working through the potential proliferator's incentives. It knows that given a sufficient agreement, the potential proliferator has no reason to build a nuclear weapon, and thus the opponent has no need to fight a preventive war. There's no weapon that's going to be built, and thus preventive war is unnecessary. As a result, the deal space still exists. Where the parties would have reached an agreement with perfectly observable nuclear weapons programs, they are still reaching those agreements with unobservable weapons programs. Of course, that region actually expands. In situations where the opponent would have leveraged the threat of preventive war to offer no concessions to the potential proliferator, now the opponent is offering concessions to the potential proliferator. So we're seeing deals under a larger set of circumstances. As long as the opponent thinks that the cost of concessions is cheaper than the cost of preventive war, we have a deal being implemented. Of course, there is an important welfare difference between observable and unobservable weapons programs. Again, keep your focus up top, in that too hot region from before. With observable weapons programs, the opponent offers no nuclear-based concessions to the potential proliferator. It's as though the ability to produce nuclear weapons does absolutely nothing for the potential proliferator. With unobservable weapons programs, we're seeing a deal be struck, and as always, that deal is commensurate with the potential proliferator's ability to produce nuclear weapons and what the negotiated solution post-proliferation would look like. That means the opponent is giving concessions to the potential proliferator here with unobservable weapons programs that the opponent would not be giving with observable weapons programs. All that said, we're still missing one parameter space. If the extent of the power shift is large and the cost to build is small, we're in the top left corner. There, the opponent is calculating the number of concessions it has to give the potential proliferator, and it's getting concerned. It can't steal much because the cost to build is low. And the number of concessions it would have to give the potential proliferator if there were to be a power shift is going to be a lot because the extent of the power shift is so large. Thus, all told, the number of concessions that the opponent must give the potential proliferator to reach a non-proliferation solution is going to be very high. The cost of a deal is too big as compared to the cost of preventive war. To recap, the two key conditions going on within that missing parameter region are 1, the opponent prefers fighting a preventive war to giving concessions, and 2, the potential proliferator prefers building weapons if given no concessions. I want you to keep those conditions in mind as we further explore what needs to happen strategically within that region. To work through that logic, it might help to think about this as a 2x2 game. The opponent is choosing the row strategy, either to initiate a preventive war or pass, and the potential proliferator is playing the column strategies, deciding whether to build a nuclear weapon or pass. When these actors are making their decisions, they're in the dark about what the other has done. In practice, that's because when the potential proliferator is choosing whether to develop a nuclear weapon, the opponent has not yet actually decided whether to fight a preventive war. But from the opponent's perspective, when it's choosing whether to initiate a preventive war or not, it does not yet know whether the potential proliferator has chosen to build or pass. That decision has already been made, it's just that the opponent isn't observing it. Given each of these countries' choices, we could end up in one of 4 different outcomes. If the opponent prevents and the potential proliferator builds, then we have a standard preventive war occurring, where the potential proliferator is paying money to develop a nuclear weapon that it's not actually obtaining access to. If the opponent prevents while the potential proliferator passes, then you have what one might think of as a mistaken preventive war. There is no power shift actually occurring, but nevertheless, the opponent is fighting a war to try to stop it. If the opponent passes while the potential proliferator also passes, then we're just maintaining the status quo. And finally, if the opponent passes while the potential proliferator builds, then we have a successful power shift occurring. So what's actually going to happen? Can we predict a single outcome will certainly be the result of this interaction? Well, if we could, then the countries that are actually playing this interaction should be able to reason through that as well. So let's check to see whether we can accurately predict a single outcome, and both countries are okay with that, and would not want to choose to do something different. For example, can it be the case that we have mistaken war occurring with certainty? Well, obviously not. If you were the opponent in this situation, you are fighting a preventive war for no good reason. The potential proliferator isn't actually building a weapon. So if you knew this would be the outcome, you would not stick to preventing. You would switch to passing so that you could maintain the status quo instead. Can we keep the status quo as the outcome for certain? Well, the answer to that again is no. We're looking at the conditions where the potential proliferator thinks that the investment in nuclear weapons is worthwhile. So if it knows that the opponent is not offering any concessions and is not planning on launching a preventive war, it would prefer to initiate a successful power shift rather than maintain the status quo. Well, can we have a power shift occurring with certainty if everyone knows that that's going to happen? Again, the answer is no. Under those conditions, the opponent now is anticipating a power shift happening. And given the conditions that we are exploring for this particular parameter space, we have established the fact that the opponent would prefer fighting a preventive war under those circumstances. Finally, can we have the war outcome be what's happening for sure? The answer is no, but this one is a little bit less straightforward. Here, the potential proliferator is trying to develop nuclear weapons and paying a cost to do so. But it's never going to have access to those weapons. It knows that the opponent is fighting a preventive war instead. As a result, it would be better for the potential proliferator to not waste the money on a weapons program that it will never ultimately have access to. It should just fight a war under the normal circumstances and not have a needless extra cost tacked on. So it seems that we're at a bit of an impasse. But in fact, we can describe what should be happening in broad strokes. Neither player should be behaving predictably. If they do, the other side can exploit them. Instead, they need to sometimes take one action and sometimes take the other action. That is, the potential proliferator some portion of the time should choose to build nuclear weapons, and some portion of the time should choose not to build nuclear weapons. The opponent some portion of the time should choose to launch preventive war, and some other portion of the time choose not to launch preventive war. They are randomizing. They are not behaving predictably. Lots of interesting implications follow from this. All outcomes must occur with positive probability. If both countries are randomizing and choosing each of their strategies with positive probability, then all four outcomes that are associated with those pairs of strategies must also be occurring with positive probability. This includes successful power shifts, so we have another explanation for why nuclear weapons are developed. And the reason that bargaining is failing here is that the opponent is unwilling to pay the correct price of concessions necessary to convince the potential proliferator not to build. But the opponent is also unwilling to prevent with certainty, because if it tried doing that, then the potential proliferator could exploit it. And as a reminder, none of this happens with observable weapons programs, because the opponent will just leverage the threat of preventive war to convince the potential proliferator not to build under these circumstances. Another outcome that occurs with positive probability is preventive war. This is something that we have yet to encounter. With observable weapons programs, the threat to initiate a preventive war is enough to convince the potential proliferator not to build nuclear weapons, and thus renders the need to fight a preventive war moot. Here, that's not happening. The opponent cannot trust that the potential proliferator will lay down its arms program and not secretly try to develop a nuclear weapon. As a consequence, the opponent needs to sometimes prevent to keep the potential proliferator honest. This is also giving us an explanation for why we observe potential proliferators wasting investment costs. Those potential proliferators aren't sure whether the opponent is going to initiate a preventive war or not, and is sometimes trying to build nuclear weapons to sneak in a power shift while the potential proliferator's opponent is standing down. Finally, and perhaps most interesting, mistaken war occurs with positive probability. That might sound insane, that the opponent would sometimes be fighting a preventive war to stop a weapons program that doesn't exist. But it's not occurring due to irrationality, and it's not occurring by accident. Instead, it's an intentional design decision by the opponent. The opponent knows that when it's choosing to fight a preventive war some portion of the time, it might be getting its decision wrong. But the alternative is to never fight, and if it never fights, then the potential proliferator will exploit it by developing nuclear weapons all the time. This implication has an interesting connection to the Iraq War. Earlier in this course, we talked about how President George W. Bush had a domestic political motivation to fight this conflict. That is, heading into the 2004 election, there was an incentive to keep the narrative focused on what was going on internationally, rather than what was going on at home. I want you to set that aside, and along with that, any narratives about misleading intelligence that led the United States to fight this war. I know that might be difficult, but I want you to do it for the sake of a thought experiment. The model tells us that outcomes like the Iraq War can happen under rational circumstances. And I know that this looks ridiculous in retrospect. The United States fights a preventive war against Iraq to stop Iraq from developing nuclear weapons, only to find out later that Iraq did not have a functional nuclear weapons program and was nowhere near able to acquire nuclear weapons. And it's all because of the observation problem. To keep potential proliferators honest, opponents sometimes have to fight preventive wars, even though, again, they know that those wars will ultimately prove to be futile. Now, I'm not saying that's actually what happened with the Iraq War. Instead, what I want to motivate is the idea that you can't just look at a crazy outcome and say that it was a crazy process that led us to that outcome. If Iraq doesn't end up having nuclear weapons, we can't just say, well, it was either an irrational process that the United States had that led to this war, or there was some sort of underlying bias within the United States and its domestic political system which led to this war. That might be the case. But there's another null hypothesis out there, namely that this sort of outcome could be caused by opponents trying to keep potential proliferators honest. So if you want to motivate the idea that the Iraq War was started because of domestic political biases, then you should also be thinking about how this sort of logic does not apply. You can't just look at the outcome and say it's crazy and have that be your proof positive. That wraps up this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you next time. Take care.